Out in the Caribbean, something fundamental shifted. Not another press release, not another sanction on paper. This time, power became physical. Tankers were intercepted, routes were controlled. According to the material you've seen, 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil changed hands not through markets, but through enforcement. And in that moment, a hard truth surfaced. China is described as buying around 80% of Venezuela's oil, yet when access vanished, Beijing could only protest with words. No ships, no countermove, just silence. Here's the lesson you're not supposed to miss. Power is not what you claim. Power is what you can actually control. If you want to understand how energy, technology, and trust are being turned into weapons, stay with me and share this with one person who still thinks this is just politics. Because what looks like a single seizure is actually the opening move of a much larger system. Let me be precise about what you're watching. This is not a story about Venezuela. It's not even a story about China. It's a story about how power actually works in the modern system. For years, we were told globalization made force obsolete, that markets would replace muscle, that interdependence guaranteed stability. But the material in front of you shows the opposite. When pressure rises, the system doesn't become polite. It becomes mechanical. Energy is not just a commodity. It's the foundational brick of societies. Control the flow, and you don't need to fire a shot. What happened in the Caribbean exposed a hierarchy most people prefer not to see. Some actors can enforce outcomes. Others can only react. And once you see that hierarchy, you start noticing it everywhere. In contracts, in shipping lanes, in technology access, because the real conflict isn't loud. It's structural. And to understand where it came from, we need to step backward into the history that built this system. To understand this moment, you have to step back before the tankers, before the seizures. Back to how energy became the backbone of power. For decades, global order was built on one assumption. Oil would flow freely because everyone needed everyone else. Producers needed buyers. Buyers needed stability. But that balance only works when no one can physically dominate the system. The material you provided shows where that assumption breaks. The United States didn't just sanction Venezuela. It moved to control infrastructure, routes, and ownership. That's the historical shift. From indirect pressure to direct command. China built its energy strategy on access. Buying from sanctioned or unstable states, believing distance meant safety. Venezuela, Iran, cheap supply, long-term dependence. But access is not control, and diversification without protection is exposure. Once enforcement enters the picture, history stops being theoretical. It becomes logistical. Who controls ships? Who controls ports? Who decides what moves and what doesn't? And that brings us to the first rupture. The moment the system snapped into crisis, the first crisis didn't announce itself with explosions. It arrived quietly through logistics. Tankers carrying sanctioned Venezuelan oil were stopped. Not delayed, stopped. According to the material, the United States didn't just block sales. It secured control over the oil itself, about 50 million barrels, and redirected it into markets under U.S. supervision. Revenue that once flowed to Caracas was cut off. Supply that once flowed to China disappeared. This is where the system revealed its teeth. China protested, called it bullying. Strong words, no ships. Contrast that with Russia threatening military retaliation over seized tankers. China did not escalate. It absorbed the loss. Why? Because escalation requires capacity, not outrage. This was the moment Beijing understood the risk it had been carrying for years, being the largest buyer without the ability to defend the route. If this surprised you, pause and share this with someone who still believes power today is only economic. Because this crisis wasn't the end. It was the signal. And what came next exposed the deeper mechanism underneath everything you've just seen. What you're seeing is not improvisation. It's a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Sanctions were never the end goal. They were the gate. Control was always the destination. The mechanism works in layers. First, legal pressure isolates a supplier. Then financial channels narrow who can pay. Finally, physical enforcement decides who receives. Once that final layer is activated, markets stop being neutral. They become administered. The United States didn't need to replace Venezuela as a producer. It only needed to decide where Venezuelan oil could go. That single ability rewired the entire flow. China's mistake was structural. It believed volume equaled security. That buying enough meant safety. But energy security is not about how much you purchase. It's about who controls the last mile. Shipping lanes, ports, insurance, payment systems miss just one of those. And supply becomes theoretical. This is why words failed. This is why outrage changed nothing. And once this mechanism locked into place, it didn't stay in Venezuela. It began to move into other suppliers, other materials, and eventually into technology itself, which is where the second rupture begins. The second rupture didn't come from oil. It came from panic. China began to realize what losing Venezuela actually meant. Because at the same time, another pillar looked unstable: Iran. According to the material, China consumes more than 90% of Iran's exported oil to suppliers, both sanctioned, both exposed, and suddenly both uncertain. If Iran shifts politically, that supply weakens. If enforcement tightens, that supply vanishes. This is how an energy crisis forms, not overnight, but all at once. Energy is the foundational brick of society. Remove it, and everything above starts to crack. Factories slow, costs rise, confidence breaks. China wasn't just losing oil. It was losing margin, time, options. This is where the system cornered Beijing. Scrambling for replacement supply in a market where the United States is the largest oil producer, the largest LNG producer, and deeply embedded with Gulf suppliers. There was no clean exit, only worse choices. And when states feel trapped, they reach for the tools they still think they control. That's when China turned to a different weapon. Now, let me bring this down to where it actually lands on you. Because when energy becomes scarce, it doesn't stay in spreadsheets. It shows up in prices, in jobs, in uncertainty you can't quite name, but feel every day. When a system scrambles for oil, costs rise quietly first. Transport, manufacturing, food, then wages lag, then growth slows. You don't hear energy insecurity at the checkout counter. You hear excuses. You feel pressure. And when trust collapses, when contracts require 100% prepayment, when supply chains fracture, risk gets passed downward from states to companies to households, that's the hidden tax of geopolitics. If this feels familiar, you're not imagining it. You're living inside the consequences of a system under stress. If this helped you see the pattern more clearly, share it with one person who's wondering why things feel tighter, harsher, less stable. Because what's happening to individuals is only a reflection of what's happening globally. And once we zoom back out, the scale becomes impossible to ignore. Once you step back, the pattern becomes global. This isn't one country losing supply. It's the system reorganizing itself. When energy routes are controlled, every dependent economy adjusts. Allies align more tightly. Neutral states hedge. Vulnerable ones get priced out. According to the material, the United States now sits at the center of multiple energy networks. Domestic production, Venezuela's reserves, Guyana's rise, and deep ties with Gulf producers. That's not influence. That's coordination power. China, by contrast, is pushed into competition for what's left, scrambling in markets shaped by rules it didn't write and cannot enforce. This creates a chain reaction. Supply chains shorten, Trust fragments. Efficiency is replaced by security. You see it in shipping, in insurance, in technology access, in contracts that suddenly demand cash up front. The world doesn't split loudly. It separates quietly into blocks that trade trust internally and suspicion externally. And once that separation hardens, the future stops being a straight line. It branches, which brings us to the only question that matters now. Where does this system go next? From here, the system doesn't move in one direction. It fractures into possibilities. The first path is stabilization, a hard bargain. China secures alternative supply, pays higher costs, accepts tighter terms. The United States keeps leverage, but restraint returns. Markets function less efficiently, more cautiously. Tension remains, but the system holds. The second path is managed division. Blocs harden. Energy, technology, finance, each reorganized around trust, not price. China builds parallel systems, slower and more expensive. The United States deepens alliances, sets standards, enforces access. Global growth slows, but predictability survives. The third path is rupture. Enforcement tightens. Suppliers flip. Technology access narrows further. Energy scarcity becomes political instability. And when pressure concentrates long enough, miscalculation follows. None of these futures are ideological. They're mechanical. Systems don't care about pride or promises. They respond to incentives, constraints, and control. The material you've seen points to one conclusion. Whoever governs the flow governs the outcome. And that leaves us with a final question. Not about China, not about the United States, but about what this moment teaches us. Because the real insight isn't geopolitical, it's systemic. Let me leave you with the insight that matters most. What you've just seen is not the rise or fall of a country. It's the exposure of a rule. In the modern world, power does not come from size, or slogans, or ambition. It comes from control of systems, energy flows, supply chains, technology gates, trust itself. When trust erodes, everything becomes transactional. Cash up front, permission required, access revoked. That is not a moral judgment. It's a structural reality. China didn't lose because it spoke too softly. It lost because it relied on access without enforcement, because it believed participation was protection. The United States didn't win because it shouted louder. It won because it could decide what moved and what didn't. If you remember one thing from this analysis, let it be this. The future won't be shaped by who promises more. It will be shaped by who controls the flow. If this gave you clarity, follow for the next episode. Because the next question is unavoidable. What happens when more systems reach this breaking point? And when they do, who pays the price? Stay with me.